This is part 2 of the characteristics of living things. We're going to start, in part 1, the main characteristic that we discussed was the fact that living things are organized, and we talked about all the levels of organization in living things. We talked about emergent properties that we see as we put the smaller parts together. We see things become more complicated, and we see the beginnings of an organ from tissues. We see an organism coming from organ systems and tissues put together in a proper way, etc. So we're moving on to other things that all living things share. And so the second one is that living things metabolize, which means they use energy. I know I touched on this barely in the part 1. All living things use energy. As a matter of fact, this is yet another reason why viruses are not considered alive. They do not metabolize. They are a little set of DNA, and all they basically do is float around, attach to a cell, and when they attach properly, it sort of creates this little opening, and their DNA goes into the cell. That's it. And then the cell builds viruses, and it goes from there. So there is no metabolism in a virus, and so by our definition, technically a virus is also not a living thing. And then homeostasis is a huge theme, and it comes up on the AP exam a lot, especially, for example, when we talk about hormones and negative feedback. For example, you have a feedback loop that exists between calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. One of them will cause your bones to pull calcium out of the blood and deposit it. But if there's not enough calcium, because calcium is necessary for muscle contraction, then the other hormone would be released, which is now going to cause your bones to release the calcium back into the blood for the muscles. So you have this relationship between these two hormones, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, that maintain levels. Your hypothalamus controls temperature. So if you start to get too hot, a message gets sent to cause you to sweat, open up your pores, dilate your blood vessels, and therefore cool off your body. If you start to get cold, then your hypothalamus sends another message, the opposite message, form goosebumps, which are going to trap heat. That makes the hairs on your arms and legs stand up. That traps heat next to your skin. Your blood vessels constrict. You start shivering, which is actually your muscles contracting, which generates heat. So we see negative feedback a lot because we have to living things maintain a balance, a state of homeostasis. Okay. The flow of energy goes along with all of this as well, and there's an important thing that you need to understand, and that is energy is not created or destroyed. You've heard of that, the first law of thermodynamics, but it does get transformed. So we're not creating energy. Plants don't create energy for animals. What's happening is the energy is changing forms. It's going from the sun, the producers, the plants, and other autotrophic organisms can now convert that energy into energy that's stuck in the bonds of the sugars. Then when we eat the sugars, the energy is now going to be converted into other forms. So energy is being transformed. It gets stored temporarily in bonds. The final form of energy is heat. So eventually all of the energy is being transformed into basically a form that's less useful. Eventually it becomes heat. Now matter is recycled, even though energy is not. So you have your producers, which are taking that energy and they are trapping it in sugars, and then you have your consumers that pick up the energy by eating the producers. So you see the energy being passed along. Now, when a consumer dies, what's going to happen is our decomposers are going to recycle the matter that's there, and some of that matter still contains energy. So the energy is not necessarily being recycled. What's happening is that the energy that was still trapped is now being passed on again. And so it's a very important thing. The matter can be recycled, the nutrients can be recycled, but the energy is not recycled. It's just passed from one place to another, changing forms. A good example that we see of this is of matter recycling would simply be the photosynthesis cell respiration cycle. Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide. It releases oxygen as a byproduct, whereas cell respiration requires oxygen and releases carbon dioxide as a byproduct. So we see a cycling right there of the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. So that would be an example of chemicals getting recycled. This is just a little diagram. Living things interact with other organisms and with their environments. In other words, we see competition even in plants. There's competition for space, there's competition for light. In the rainforest, little short plants are not going to do very well because the taller plants have huge leaves and they're taking the sunlight. But all living things interact with others. If you think about this little picture I put here, you have the tree. The tree provides home for some organisms. It changes the composition of the air by releasing oxygen into the air. It also is changing the soil composition. When it dies, it is now adding nutrients to the soil that can allow other things to grow. So there's a lot of interaction between all living things and what's around them. That's the whole population, community, ecosystem levels that we talk about. Another one is that living things reproduce. And basically, you can't see my little comic there. I'm going to move this down. The idea is that when we say living things reproduce, we're talking about DNA. All living things contain DNA, and the DNA gets incorporated into genes and chromosomes. In us, in eukaryotic organisms, we see those little X-shaped things. Those are the chromosomes. And in prokaryotic organisms, the DNA is usually found in a loop. But the bottom line is, it's still genetic information. If you think about it, you have a sperm and an egg, and all that's in there is DNA. And just that DNA then has the ability to send instructions to build an entire baby from a single cell that's just has no characteristics of a baby. And so and what genes really do is they control the production of proteins. And we're made out of other things besides proteins, but proteins are really responsible for the major structures and functions of our body. Enzymes are proteins. Most hormones are proteins. Proteins in the cell membrane control what enters and leaves. So pigments are proteins. Hemoglobin that carries oxygen in your body is a protein. So protein production is the most important thing that's going to give us our characteristics. And so the DNA is the blueprints. All living things have DNA, and the DNA is the only thing that gets passed on to the next generation when living things reproduce. And then finally, living things evolve. And evolution is a core theme in biology. You hear it a lot, and I know it can be I believe in evolution, I don't believe in evolution, but specifically the focus in here is on evolution in the sense that organisms can change over time. In other words, you can have organisms that are extinct. They are ancestors of organisms that exist today. You have extinct groups of tortoises, and we see the tortoises today. And why do those tortoises exist today? Well, because probably what's happened is there have been mutations. The mutations gave some tortoises different characteristics. If those characteristics were beneficial, natural selection, survival of the fittest, would decide the fate of the characteristic. If it's a beneficial characteristic, it may have helped that organism live longer, reproduce more, and pass that trait on. And it's not just natural selection, it's also sometimes random chance. Sometimes a trait is a really good trait, but if the organism that has it, for whatever reason, doesn't happen to reproduce, then that trait may die it will die with the organism. But natural selection combined with chance and mutations are what give organisms new traits, new abilities, and that is the basis when we talk about evolution being a theme. It's all related. The genetics is the heritable material that's being passed on, and we know that mutations happen. I think it's 1 in every million genes copied has mutations, something like that. So there's small numbers of mutations going on all the time. And we can see the relationship between organisms using DNA. We build cladograms and family trees. The whole system of classification that we have, although it's built from lots of things, one of the major things we use today to look at how closely related organisms are is we look at their DNA. Because if they have similar biochemistry, if their DNA has genes that make the same exact proteins, we can determine that they may be very closely related to each other. And here's just an example your book actually had, which I thought was a really good example of mutations and selection. Probably this is not natural selection. I would be willing to bet that some of these are all pigeons. And I'm sure that some of these pigeons have come about by artificial selection, that we have chosen for whatever reason, to breed pigeons for a particular trait that we like. We do it with dogs too. You know, you see the cute little wrinkly Shar-Peis and you know, beagles and collies and, you know, working dogs. Dogs have all sorts of different characteristics, and they've been bred specifically to be good at certain things. And so that's artificial selection. But the bottom line is these different traits come about by mutation, and then they either get passed on or they don't. And by getting these new combinations every time an organism reproduces, we get just a huge variety. And in this case, I think this is a really good example of extreme variety in these pigeons. And the last thing your book has in this chapter, and I think it's an important note, is that there's unity. This whole thing has been partly about characteristics that living things have in common, and then we've talked about how living things are different. And probably the important thing to take from this is that even though we're different, there are some things that we all have in common. And a good example is DNA. DNA is universal. If I take DNA from a jellyfish that codes for glowing, which we're going to do, and put it into a bacteria, the bacteria will make the same protein and glow because the DNA is translated the same way. If a particular 3-letter code codes for making a particular amino acid in a frog, it will make the same amino acid no matter what organism we put it in. So DNA is interpreted universally the same. And we see, you know, all living things, again, are made of cells. They all metabolize. They all reproduce. And so even though we're diverse, remember that there is unity as well. These are the core characteristics. What this whole chapter sort of been about are the core characteristics of what we have in common with each other. So hopefully, if you have questions, come see me in class. But hopefully, although I talked through this really quickly, I think it's a pretty easy chapter, and that's it.